when a young black girl asked to use the shooting range. The colonel laughed in her face and told her to go home. But what happened next left an entire base speechless. She picked up that rifle and broke every Navy SEAL shooting record in the book. Here's how she did it. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories at Camp Iron Hawk. A dusty base on the edge of the Nevada desert. A young girl named Amara stood at the gates. Just 12 years old, wearing an oversized camouflage jacket that once belonged to her late father. She clutched a piece of paper so tightly it had started to crumple at the corners. On that paper, written in clean black ink, was permission to visit the base's shooting range for a single day, a rare courtesy granted by an old friend of her father's. Amara's father, Sergeant Lewis, had been one of the best snipers the base had ever seen. People still spoke of his steady hands, sharp eyes, and calm voice that never wavered, even in the worst of storms. When he passed away 2 years ago, a piece of Amara went with him. But she never let the rest go. She carried his stories, his jacket, and now, the same determination that once made him a legend. The desert sun burned hot as she stepped across the dusty compound, boots crunching on gravel that seemed to stretch forever. She could feel eyes on her, groups of soldiers leaning against Humvees, sitting on crates, stopping mid-conversation just to see if they were really looking at a tiny girl on a military base. When Amara reached the range, she saw it. A long line of metal tables under a half-torn canopy, spent casings scattered like tiny brass flowers at the shooter's feet. Beyond the line were rows of distant targets, human silhouettes and bullseyes pinned against stacked sandbags. But as soon as Amara placed her foot near the line, a hush fell over the small crowd of soldiers. They nudged each other, whispering, some smirking, some shaking their heads. That's when she heard the heavy boots. Colonel Briggs emerged from behind a truck, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose voice could cut through a thunderstorm. He wore his cap tilted low and had a grin that rarely meant something good. He stopped right in front of her, peering down over the rims of his sunglasses. "Little girl, you lost? This ain't no place to play dolls." Amara's throat tightened, but she forced her chin up and unfolded the paper with both hands. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes did not waver. "I want to shoot, sir. Just once." The colonel glanced at the paper, then back at her. And then, loud and sudden, came his laugh, deep, echoing through the camp like a shotgun blast. Some of the nearby soldiers snorted and chuckled, leaning in closer to see what would happen next. "You think you can handle that? These are Navy SEAL-level targets, sweetheart. Maybe come back in 10 years. Briggs barked, wiping a tear of laughter from the corner of his eye. Amara didn't flinch. She felt her father's jacket, heavy on her small shoulders, and she saw her father's hands in her mind, how he'd once placed them over hers when she held his old hunting rifle for the first time. "Give me one chance," she said, her voice clear and calm. Briggs's grin faded into something else, curiosity, maybe, or the memory of the man whose jacket she now wore. He glanced at a nearby sergeant, who gave a helpless shrug. Finally, with an exaggerated sigh, Briggs motioned to the shooting bench. "Fine. One shot. If you miss, you pack up and go home." "Deal." Amara nodded once, then stepped forward. One of the soldiers reluctantly helped her set up a modern sniper rifle, black, sleek, balanced on a sturdy bipod. It looked twice her size. Her hands, though small, moved with careful purpose, adjusting the scope just like her father had taught her in their backyard so many nights ago. Behind her, the crowd fell quiet. Even the desert wind seemed to pause. Amara lowered her head behind the scope. She slowed her breathing, in, out. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she found it, that quiet place where the world narrowed to a single point far ahead. She remembered her father's words: "Squeeze, don't jerk. Trust your eyes. Trust your hands." The metal was cool against her cheek. Her finger curled around the trigger. She found the target, a distant silhouette painted in black. Her father had once said that a true sniper could hear the shot before it even happened. She understood that now. The shot cracked through the camp. For a second, no one breathed. Then a distant clang echoed from the steel plate downrange. Dead center, Amara lifted her head. The colonel's mouth hung open just a little. Around him, the soldiers exchanged looks of disbelief and quiet respect. Colonel Briggs cleared his throat. then gave a single nod. Guess the apple didn't fall far, huh? Amara allowed herself the smallest smile. For the first time in 2 years, she felt him there. Not gone, just here. In the wind and the echo and the weight of the rifle she held steady in her hands, a young sergeant named Miller, barely in his mid-20s, but already with a scar above his brow from a mission gone sideways, stepped forward through the tight circle of soldiers. He'd served alongside Amara's father back when he was just a green recruit who could barely hold his rifle straight. Sergeant Lewis had taught him how to keep calm under fire, how to pick his moment and trust the shot. And now, looking at Amara, Miller saw that same calm, that same spark that never faded, even when the desert sun was merciless and the stakes were high. "Sir," Miller said, his voice steady but respectful, "let her try. What's the worst that could happen?" Colonel Briggs turned his glare from Amara to Miller, lips twitching in irritation. "She misses, wastes our time, goes home crying, and then I get a call from some lawyer. That's what." But Miller didn't back down. He saw the way Amara stood, back straight, feet planted like she'd been there 1,000 times before. He remembered Lewis saying once that courage isn't about size or age. It's about staring something bigger than you in the eye and refusing to blink. "With respect, sir," Miller said, choosing his words like stepping over tripwire, "I think she's got it in her." Sergeant Lewis would have wanted her to have the chance. Briggs scoffed, but a few of the older soldiers behind him shifted their weight, nodding slightly. They remembered Lewis, too. The stories that still circled the barracks when the lights went out and the cards came out. Briggs finally threw his hands up, exasperated. "Fine. Give her the standard SEAL course. Let's see if she can even hit one target." A ripple of low chatter spread through the men. The SEAL course wasn't for rookies. It wasn't even for half the men standing here. It was 10 steel targets scattered at random distances, some still, some on pulleys that jerked them sideways or dropped them behind cover with barely a second's warning. Even the best shots sometimes walked away with only 6 or 7 hits. Miller turned to Amara and knelt so his eyes were level with hers. The laughter faded behind them. The mocking had shifted into a tense hush. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, his tone more like a big brother than a sergeant. "You can just take one shot, prove your point, and go home." "No, shame in that." But Amara shook her head. She unfolded the sleeves of her father's jacket, so they didn't get in the way, and tucked them neatly under her elbows. "I want the course," she said. "I want to see if I can do what he did." Miller held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, then nodded. He stood and motioned her to the firing line. Soldiers who moments ago had been grinning were now silent, eyes locked on the little girl who looked like a memory come back to life. They laid out the rifle on a sturdy metal table, its bipod legs clicking into place on the scratched steel surface. The desert breeze kicked up a swirl of dust that settled on the barrel as Miller talked her through it. "Okay, listen. Take your time. Don't rush the targets. Breath slow. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Your finger doesn't yank. It squeezes, soft as a whisper. Between each shot, find your heartbeat. Settle it. That's how your dad did it." Amara didn't nod or smile. She just listened, dark eyes flicking from Miller to the scope to the targets lined up downrange. Small dots shimmering under the desert sun. When Miller handed her the rifle, she didn't hesitate. The moment her hands closed around the grip, it was as if the ghost of her father wrapped his arms around her from behind, steadying her, whispering in the wind. She lay prone behind the rifle, elbows dug into the rough table. Miller adjusted the scope for her, whispering about wind direction and the slight left drift they always got in the afternoon. Around her, boots scuffed the gravel as soldiers shifted for a better view. Even Briggs crossed his arms and leaned in, his earlier mockery replaced by the reluctant curiosity of a man who'd seen the impossible once or twice in his career. Amara exhaled, feeling the warmth of the metal against her cheek. She saw her father's hands over hers, guiding, never forcing. She lined up the first target, a human silhouette at 100 yards. The shot cracked. The steel rang like a bell. Without a word, she shifted to the next, this one on a pulley, sliding left. She tracked it, breathing slow, letting the noise fall away. The rifle barked again. Another ring. Miller's grin spread wide. Behind him, the older soldiers began to murmur, soft but reverent, point one by one, target after target, Amara moved like she'd done this 1,000 times in her dreams. The hardest target, a half-hidden plate that popped up for barely 2 seconds, swung up from behind a sandbag. Amara was already there. The steel clanged, louder than before. When the last shot echoed into the desert, Amara lifted her head. Her chest rose and fell, but her hands didn't shake. Miller clapped her gently on the shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. Colonel Briggs stared at her, at the rifle, at the line of targets. Each one struck dead center, and let out a low whistle. For the first time that day, he didn't have anything clever to say. Amara just looked at the sky, the sun bright and blinding, and felt her father smiling down at her. She hadn't just held his rifle today. She'd carried his legacy and made it her own. The wind was harsh. The sun pressed down on her back, burning through the thin fabric of her oversized jacket, but Amara barely noticed. She lay flat on the course mat, elbows braced, cheek pressed to the rifle's stock. The cold metal steadied her heartbeat like a hand on her shoulder. Through the scope, the world shrank to a circle of desert heat and distant steel. She could feel the soldiers behind her, their boots shifting in the gravel, their breath held tight between disbelief and the scraps of old jokes that died on their tongues. The first target popped up, 300 meters out, a steel silhouette painted black. It swung slightly in the breeze, taunting her. Somewhere behind her, a pair of young privates nudged each other, whispering bets under their breath. One of them stifled a laugh that came out as a snort. Amara ignored them. She felt the sweat trickle down her forehead, sting her eyes. She didn't wipe it away. She blinked once, focused, exhaled slow. Squeeze, don't jerk. Her father's voice again. Always calm. Always there. Crack. The shot snapped through the dry air. A sharp thunder that bounced off the canvas tents and the Humvee parked behind the line. A heartbeat later, the target rocked backward and fell with a metallic clang that seemed to echo forever. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the hiss of the desert wind brushing over sandbags and the steady drum of her heartbeat. Then a ripple of murmurs broke out behind her. Colonel Briggs frowned, arms crossed so tight the veins stood out in his forearms. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, though the doubt flickered in his eyes. Miller stood at her side, arms folded but his fingers tapping his bicep in quiet excitement. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He'd seen that look before. Once, long ago, when Sergeant Lewis had done the same thing in the rain on a field half a world away. The second target rose. 400 meters. This one shifted side to side on a pulley, mimicking a moving threat. Amara breathed in, caught the motion, waited for the sway to reach its farthest point. Crack. The clang rang out, sharp and true. This time, no one laughed. A few soldiers leaned forward, arms resting on their knees, eyes narrowed as if willing her to miss, or daring her to keep going. Next came 500 meters. The heat haze shimmered off the sand like a mirage, blurring the edges of the steel plate. Amara adjusted the scope, her small fingers quick and precise. She remembered her father's hands guiding hers, the way he'd taught her to read the wind by feeling it on her cheek and watching the dust dance in the air. The rifle kicked. The target dropped, silence behind her. Even Briggs didn't have a quip ready this time. 600 meters. A cold gust swept through the camp, kicking up a swirl of grit that stung her face and caught in her hair. She didn't flinch. She shifted her shoulder, adjusted her position, and watched the way the wind carried the flag near the range tower. Small adjustments. Her father's lessons burned into her bones. Crack. Bullseye. Miller let out a low whistle, a sound that almost startled the quiet. Some of the older soldiers, the ones who'd known Lewis, exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. It was like watching a ghost, they thought. But there was no ghost here, just a girl, alive and breathing, proving she belonged. Amara's eyes stayed locked to the scope. Her heartbeat didn't care about the men behind her, or their surprise, or their growing respect. She was somewhere else, on a porch in the early morning with her dad, the smell of oil and gunpowder and the weight of her father's calm voice in her ear. One by one, the targets rose. 700, 800. Each shot cracked like thunder. Each target slammed backward or spun from the force. Each clang a note in a song only she could hear. The ninth shot. A bead of sweat dripped from her brow, slid over her cheek, and disappeared into the dusty mat. She blinked it away. Her shoulder ached under the stock's recoil. She ignored it. Her father had once told her, "The rifle is an extension of you. If your hands are steady, so is the shot." The 10th target rose. 900 meters, almost half a mile. The final test, even seasoned marksmen sometimes failed. The steel plate glimmered like a mirage at the edge of the world. Behind her, no one spoke. Briggs shifted his weight, the disbelief on his face replaced by something grudging, almost respectful. The soldiers watched, hats pulled low against the sun, but no one blinked. Amara slowed her breathing, in through her nose, out through her mouth. She found her heartbeat, the way her father had taught her. She felt the wind lift a wisp of hair across her cheek. She counted to 3. Crack, the shot sailed. For a split second, it was silent. Then the distant clang echoed back like thunder. Rolling through the empty desert, she lifted her head from the scope. Her cheeks were sunburned, her arms sore, but she didn't feel any of it. She felt her father's presence like an embrace. Warm, proud, unbreakable. N01 laughed now. There was only the hush of the wind, the smell of gunpowder, and the knowledge that Sergeant Lewis's legacy had just found new life. Not in stories told around campfires, but in the steady hands and fierce eyes of a 12-year-old girl who refused to miss. Colonel Briggs stepped closer, boots crunching on the dry gravel, arms folded so tight across his chest it looked like he was holding himself together. His jaw worked behind his sun-cracked skin, trying to hide the shock that flickered across his eyes every time he looked at the targets lined up downrange. Each one struck clean through the center by a 12-year-old girl wearing her father's old jacket. Miller turned to Briggs, his grin wide under the shadow of his cap. "Colonel, she's cleared the standard course. Perfect score." Briggs's eyes flicked from Miller to Amara, who was kneeling beside the rifle, checking the chamber the way her father had shown her, making sure it was safe. She looked so small behind that heavy weapon, but there was nothing small about the way she carried herself. Steady hands, steady heart. Briggs cleared his throat. "That's all fine, but any lucky brat can get a few good shots in. Let's see if she can handle the real thing." Miller's brow furrowed. "Sir." Briggs raised a hand, pointing down the range. "Set the elite course. The SEAL record." "Hey!" Ripple ran through the gathered soldiers, a low, surprised murmur that rose like the wind. The SEAL sniper record wasn't just a test, it was a legend. 10 moving targets at random distances, swinging on pulleys, popping up from trenches, ducking behind barriers. The shooter had 5 minutes to hit every mark. Even seasoned Navy SEALs trained years to match the record. No rookie ever came close. Amara stood, dust brushing off her knees. Her eyes met Briggs's, not defiant, not afraid, but calm. She didn't even blink. Miller glanced at her, concern flickering across his face. "Amara, this is tough," he said gently, leaning closer so only she could hear. "No one expects you to do this. Take your time. Just do your best." Amara reached into the inside pocket of her father's jacket and brushed her fingers over the small patch sewn there. A faded cloth insignia that had belonged to Sergeant Lewis's unit. She whispered so quietly that only the wind heard her. "For you, Dad." She lay back down, her cheeks settling into the warm metal of the rifle's stock. The breeze gusted across the range, tugging at her hair where it had slipped free from its tie. She ignored it. Through the scope, the world shrank again. No soldiers, no sunburn, no biting wind. Just the targets, the breath in her lungs, and the memory of her father's voice. Miller raised a hand. "Course ready." A deep buzzer cracked the silence. The first target swung out from behind a wooden barrier, a steel silhouette gliding fast at 250 meters. Amara shifted her aim in a breath, squeezed the trigger, cracked. A metallic clang. Target down. The second popped up further back, ducking behind a stack of sandbags. Amara adjusted, found the opening, fired, crack. Another hit. The soldiers, once restless and skeptical, were now statues. Their eyes tracked each swing, each pop-up, each flick of the girl's small hands as she adjusted windage, flicked the safety, found her rhythm. The third target swung on a wide arc, 400 meters, darting in and out of her scope. Amara waited. Her finger brushed the trigger, counting the heartbeat between its motion. The rifle barked. The arc stopped. Another clang point. One by one, the targets came alive, some small, some distant, some rising only for a blink before dropping again. She tracked them all, her breathing deep and even. Sweat dripped from her brow, clung to her lashes, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't dare break focus. Crack, crack, crack. Miller checked his watch every few seconds, each tick louder than the wind. He stole glances at Briggs, who now stood with his mouth slightly open, arms no longer crossed, but hanging by his sides like he'd forgotten how to stand at attention. The ninth target danced at the far end of the range, nearly 1,000 meters, bobbing behind an abandoned Humvee frame. Amara shifted her elbows, slowed her breathing to nothing but a whisper. She squeezed. Crack. The Humvee door rattled as the bullet punched through, striking the steel plate dead center. The target dropped like a stone, not a single mark left. The final test. A fast-moving pop-up at 700 meters that rose, pivoted, and fell again in under 3 seconds. The crown jewel of the SEAL course, the shot that made or broke the record. Amara didn't move for a moment. She watched the wind ripple a streamer tied to a stake. She listened for the buzz that signaled the target's rise. It sprang up. A flicker of dark shape against the desert blur. Crack. The final clang rolled back across the range like distant thunder. Miller slapped the timer and stared. His eyes darted from the readout to Briggs, then back to Amara, who lay there, rifle still pressed to her shoulder, chest rising and falling in calm waves. "Colonel," Miller's voice cracked with disbelief. He turned the timer around so Briggs could see the blinking red digits. She didn't just pass. She broke the SEAL sniper record by 30 seconds. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the silence broke like a dam giving way. Soldiers who'd been stone-faced just minutes before now whooped and cheered, clapping each other on the back. A few lifted their caps and saluted, grins stretching ear to ear. The same men who'd whispered jokes when she stepped up were now shouting her name into the wind. Amara lifted her head, pushed back her hair, and set the rifle gently on the table. She stood up, dust sticking to her knees and elbows, her father's jacket hanging loose around her shoulders. Her face was calm as when she'd walked up to the range gate hours ago, but her dark eyes gleamed with a pride that no one could mistake. She turned to Miller, who looked at her like he was seeing something holy. Then to Colonel Briggs, who finally managed to close his mouth and clear his throat. For once, Briggs didn't have a snarky comment. He just gave her a sharp, clean nod, the kind of nod reserved for soldiers who'd earned their place the hard way. Amara's hands were red from the recoil, her shoulders sore. But as she stood there, listening to the cheers and the wind rustling the tents, she felt something warm and steady settle in her chest. She hadn't just fired a rifle today. She'd carved her father's name into the wind, and her own name. Right beside it, Colonel Briggs walked up to her, boots sinking into the loose gravel with each heavy step. The wind whipped at the edges of his uniform, tugged at the brim of his cap, but he didn't notice. He was too busy staring at the girl who had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about who belonged behind a sniper's scope that he stopped. A few feet away, then crouched until he was eye level with Amara. Up close, he could see the freckles on her cheeks, the sunburn on her nose, the sheen of sweat on her brow. All the marks of a long day under the desert sun. But what struck him most were her eyes, steady, unflinching, older than 12 years had any right to be. There was no mocking grin now, no sharp quip ready to fire off. Just disbelief, slowly giving way to a respect he didn't bother trying to hide anymore. He let out a breath and asked the question that had been rattling in his chest since her first shot. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Amara's lips curved into the smallest smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Those stayed locked on his, unwavering. "My dad taught me to focus," she said, her voice soft but clear. She paused, letting the words hang between them like a promise. Then she added, "And you gave me a reason to prove him right." For a moment, the desert felt like it fell, silent around them. Even the men behind him, who only minutes ago were whooping and clapping each other on the back, seemed to hush. Briggs nodded slowly, feeling the grit in the lines around his eyes. He reached out and placed a broad hand on her shoulder, careful and firm. "You've got more heart than half my men combined," he said. He swallowed hard, then added, "If he were here today, he'd be the proudest father alive." "You did him proud, Amara. You did all of us proud." Amara didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She just gave a single nod back, as crisp and sure as any salute. Behind them, Miller stepped up, carrying the folded stack of spent targets, each one bearing the clean, punched-out holes that told the story of what she'd done better than any speech could. He knelt down and carefully placed them in her old canvas bag, the same one she'd brought her permission slip in that morning. "Keep these," he said, zipping the bag shut with a grin that reached all the way to the tired lines around his eyes. "So you never forget the day you made grown men eat their words." Amara looked at the bag, then back at Miller, and for the first time all day, her smile broke wide and bright. It was the kind of smile that made Miller see not just Sergeant Lewis's ghost, but the future he'd always hoped the man's child would have. Strong, unbreakable, freed. A few of the older soldiers stepped forward, nodding to her, tipping their caps. One or two even saluted her, not as a child, but as one of their own, a warrior in spirit if not yet in rank. When it was time to leave, Amara lifted the bag over her shoulder. It looked too big for her tiny frame, but she carried it like it weighed nothing at all. She turned back once at the edge of the range. The tables, the spent brass glinting in the dust, the rows of targets swaying in the desert wind, all of it felt different now. Not just a place to shoot, but a place where she'd found her father again, if only for a few moments. She walked away from the range that day not just as a little girl who picked up a rifle, but as a legend, a story whispered between bunks, at night, told around mess hall tables, passed on to new recruits who thought they knew what limits looked like. She reminded an entire base that courage knows no age, no color, no limit. That sometimes, the smallest figure on the field carries the biggest fight in their heart. Sometimes, the people who doubt you the most become the witnesses to your greatest moment. They stand there, slack-jawed and wide-eyed, forced to swallow every word they ever used to keep you small. Amara didn't just break a record that day. She broke the chains that others tried to wrap around her. She fired a shot not just through steel plates downrange, but through every low expectation, every whisper that told her she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. So next time someone laughs at your dream, tries to shrink your fire with their doubt, remember Amara. Remember her steady hands, her calm breath, the wind in her hair, and her father's voice echoing in her mind. Pick up your rifle, whatever it may be. Take your shot. And when it hits dead center, when the clang echoes back to you, stand up proud. Let them stand there in the silence of their disbelief, and walk away carrying your legend on your shoulders. Collision if you loved Amara's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more true stories that prove bravery can come from the most unexpected places. Your dreams are your rifle. Aim true.